A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
We have our regular guest, Andrew McColl from Family Voice Australia. And today, Andrew wants to talk to us about You Get the Government You Deserve. And Andrew McColl, I want to welcome you to 2020 on this Thursday.
Thank you, Andrew, and good morning to all your listeners.
Andrew, I love the topic you're talking about today. You get the government you deserve. Tell me about that.
Sure. Well, this is the third of a series of 4 on the subject of lessons in government. And we've been looking at 1 Samuel, and 1 Samuel is clearly a story of failure and government failure. But even more than that, it's a story of sad and ongoing failure amongst the Lord's people, for Israel had been going downhill for hundreds of years. Consequently, this statement does sound harsh, but it's true. People get the government they deserve. And today, Andrew, Australians expect that they can rely on their governments, beginning with the education of their children, their health and their welfare. But this reliance has a lot of challenges attached to it. For instance, what if governments fail us? What if they cannot make good on their promises? And why should we even believe them? What does the Bible tell us about people and consequently governments? In John chapter 2, verses 24 and 25, John explained that Jesus on his part was not entrusting himself to them, for he knew all men. And because he did not need anyone to testify concerning man, for he himself knew what was in man. So this much we know: when men depart from God, they also depart from life, becoming oppressive and cruel. And God's purpose with the Exodus was to set his people free from Egypt's slavery, with all of its implications: religious, political, economic, and social. And when he called Moses, God told him that the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me. Furthermore, I've seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. That's in Exodus chapter 3, verse 9. And this should remind us today that the Christian life means freedom with responsibility. Jesus told the disciples that if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed. So, Andrew, Christian freedom, true Christian freedom, means we can speak our mind, preach the gospel, associate with people of our choice, discipline and educate our children how we wish, come and go, publish at will, protest peaceably, buy and sell, engage in enterprises of our choice, and choose our leaders. Anything less, and we are being oppressed and we're in trouble.
Wow.
So just talking about tax for a minute, we wanted to say something there, Andrew.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you've just touched on so many things. And I would like to ask you a question then, Andrew. Do you believe now Australia, I mean, we have 3 levels of government, so we're not just generalising either federal, state or local. This collectively, do you think the government in Australia right now is genuinely serving the people of Australia, or do you think it has gone to another level where most of the things you just mentioned are already happening?
Well, governments love to tell us, of course, that they're serving us. And no doubt there are a number of MPs who truly want to serve their electorates. But when does serving become self-serving? When does all of this become an exercise in someone's egotism and the glorification of someone's personal power? And it is not a case of really of one party versus another. It's the matter of attitude always. And when governments move away from scriptures, it's because something happened beforehand. This is, as I'm kind of alluding to 1 Samuel, there's a problem in the community, in the hearts of the people, and dare I say it, in and amongst God's people. So we are the ones who should be those who can firstly hold governments to account for walking away from what they should be doing. So we have to realise that the lessons of 1 Samuel are just as relevant today. In that passage that I've read before in 1 Samuel 8, the elders came to Samuel, the prophet, and said, "Hey, Samuel, give us a king. This is what the nations are doing. This is what we want to have too. So go do it, please." And if we're not happy with our government, if we're not happy with what the policies, and I'm like you, I get upset about some things that governments do, but I must stand in front of the mirror and say, well, what am I doing to bring this about? And conversely, what can I do? What should I be doing to bring about change? Not just calling up my local member and giving him an earful, but taking responsibility myself for my family and in my church and in my locality, so that I'm actually making a difference to somebody and being responsible. Big word always is going to be personal and family responsibility.
Yep. Here, Andrew. And do you think because life has been so good in Australia for so long, I mean, we've basically had about 120 years of prosperity in Australia. I mean, even in World War One, the Australian soldiers, I think, were some of the highest paid soldiers in the war. They call themselves 2 bob a day tourists, and Australia resourced them really well because there was a lot of money coming off the wool industry. Do you think life's just been so good for so long, we just sort of take it for granted that our government will look after us, and a lot of Aussies today don't really put governments under the microscope?
Well, that can be a part of the problem. And so what can happen is all of a sudden the wheels start falling off the billy cart, and we think, well, what's happening in Canberra? Well, it's happening in Canberra, yes, but it's happening all over Australia, wherever we go. People expect governments to do more for them. So when governments make promises, I will educate your children at school in the state system. Oh, yes, and there's going to be great health care, Andrew, and as for welfare, well, we're just second to none. So people think, shrug the shoulders, okay, que sera, that'll be just fine for me. What they don't realise is the enormous cost that all of these things bring on the community, not just financially, but right across the board in other things too. It just costs so much to get governments to do for you what we should be doing ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, despite that cost of living crisis, I think the trend is right now a lot of families are taking their kids out of the state system for education because they've lost faith in the government education system, and they're putting their kids in private schools because the education in Australia has become so jam-packed full of what I call left-wing ideology and woke issues rather than traditional, you know, maths, science, English, history, the stuff that actually helps you later in life. And I think that's an example where I think government in Australia is letting the people down because they're jamming the curriculum full of all this hardline left-wing agenda instead of traditional subjects, which, by the way, we're getting worse at on a worldwide scale. Australia is ranking really poorly for maths, English and science compared to other nations.
Yes. Well, this is all a part of what we need to address, and it's not just a case of ringing up the local school and giving the principal an earful. It's not his fault. He may be a part of the problem, but he has to answer to his bosses. If he says, "Oh, okay, Andrew, whatever you say," and start changing the school policy, he is going to have himself in one kind of a hurricane. He's going to be in trouble. We have people talking about, "Hey, listen, Mr. Principal, get with the plan or else." So we have to realise now it goes back much further than that. That's a part of the issue. And yes, I agree. It's encouraging to see lots and lots of people going towards the private system with schooling, but even there, it's still fed or supplied by taxpayers. So it's still going to be subject to the controls and the whims and fancies of government telling them what to do. And so we have to keep going back towards the fundamentals, which is always going to be scripture, and look at this book, the Bible, and say, well, what does this book tell me to do? Am I actually doing it? And if I'm not doing it, what must I do to change?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk about taxation then in the context of the scriptures. Let's talk about tax in Australia.
Sure. Well, looking at Israel, for the first time in its history in 1 Samuel, Israel would have taxation at 10%. This was a new burden for the people to carry. Did it improve anything? That's very doubtful. Getting out from under the burden of taxation proved to be a motivator for David to kill Goliath. How do we know this? Well, the Bible says, 1 Samuel 17, verses 24 and 25, when all the men of Israel saw the man, that's Goliath, they fled from him and were greatly afraid. The men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who is coming up? Surely he's coming up to defy Israel. And it will be that the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel," meaning no tax for that family. How much income tax did we pay at Federation in 1901? None. Today, our overall income tax rate is 24%. So what's happened in those 120 years? All over the West, the attitudes of Israel from 1050 BC has become ours. So today in Australia, as Nick Cater from The Australian has suggested, the disastrous experiments in state-run economies in Soviet states driven by mandates and 5-year plans were taken as conclusive evidence command economies didn't work. Governments in the West began to deregulate economies and were rewarded with greater prosperity. Yet left-wing economists have not been prepared to give up the fight so easily. The future made in Australia policy is driven by the hubris that the government knows best. In defiance of the long history of non-market failures and government-selected losers, the Albanese government is pressing ahead with 10-figure investments in unproven technology such as green hydrogen and quantum computing, unquote. So the 15 billion extracted from taxpayers and set aside for the Future Made in Australia Fund would pay for 15,000 Aussie houses at $1 million each. I'm sure that Mr. Chambers thinks this will be a good investment, but will it be? Can governments really pick winners?
Well, hang on. And Jim Chalmers, I mean, he's the treasurer, but what's his experience in business? Has he run a large corporation? Has he balanced the budget? The answer is no. He doesn't have a business background. So like I said, he's speculating based on academic study he's done. But, you're also too kind, Andrew. You're saying we only pay 24% tax here. We pay way more than that because we pay GST every time we purchase groceries and fuel and alcohol. If people smoke, there's a huge amount of tax in that. When you buy a house, you pay stamp duty in most states. Like the tax burden on the average Aussie, I've heard it guesstimated at about 60%. By the time you earn your money each week and you just go about your daily business and you purchase everything you need, our government gets about 60% of what we earn in Australia. Some would say, Andrew, we're one of the most overtaxed people groups in the world in Australia.
Well, hey, Andrew, I agree with you. And I was talking just about income tax, of course. But as you say, there's GST and there's sales tax. And if you buy a house, your state government says, good on you, mate. And they put their hand out for some money because that's all a part of raising taxes to fund all the things that, dare I say, people want. So it's all a matter of challenging people. And this has to begin in the Christian community and say, well, now, what do you want government to do for you? And also, are those expectations that you have of government really consistent with what we should be asking government to do for us anyway? Once you get past law and order, the Bible doesn't have much to say about government doing all these things. It stops. Whereas the things like education, it's a parental responsibility, as is health, as is welfare.
Well, let's move on to
that's where we've got to think about making changes.
Absolutely. And now let's tackle a very controversial issue in Australia because this is a very emotive issue where a lot of people's emotions come out. But let's talk about gun laws in Australia. Andrew, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, it was George Mason, who lived from 1725 to 1792, who was one of the signers of the US Declaration of Independence, who wrote that to disarm the people is the best and most effective way to enslave them. This is what led to the American Revolution and their second constitutional amendment. In 1776, the American colonists could access firearms that were as good as what the British soldiers had. The British recognised this problem early and tried to confiscate gunpowder from the Americans, but subduing the Americans proved impossible. Is it any surprise that the leftist politicians hate the US Second Amendment, which permits private ownership of weapons? And we need to understand that the restriction, confiscation or banning of the personal ownership of weapons by governments has a very ugly 20th century record. And in this context, we think about the Armenian genocide by the Turks in 1915, which cost the lives of 1.5 million people, the abuses within the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, Communist China and Cambodia under Pol Pot. Who banned the Who banned the guns? The government. Then who used guns to commit atrocities? The government. After the Russian Revolution, Lenin wrote, "A system of licensing and registration is the perfect device to deny gun ownership to the bourgeoisie." Not long afterwards, Hitler told his men that history shows that all conquerors who have allowed their subject races to carry arms have prepared their own downfall by so doing.
Yeah, there's so much there, Andrew, and what you're saying there, the average Australian would just be shaking their head going, what are you talking about? This is crazy talk. But it is history, and like you said, the sad reality is disarmed populations in the last 100 years have just been ransacked. And of course, we had that, and I'm going to call him a half-wit, that half-wit in Tasmania in 1996 shot those innocent people. And that really has shaped the narrative in Australia ever since about gun ownership. But very few Aussies actually think about what you just said, that an armed population is actually more robust and more easily able to resist oppressive government. And also in the case of Americans, a lot of Americans who believe that their homes are safer because they have firearms in their homes, which are locked up and there. But if someone tries to invade their home, they'll call 911, but they also feel they have an option to defend their homes. And I know Americans like that, Andrew, who just swear by the fact that they have a gun in the house that makes them feel safe.
Well, this is right. Now, according to the University of Hawaii Democide Project, and you can just Google this, University of Hawaii Democide Project, there were 19 genocides in the 20th century, and each of them was preceded by gun confiscation. We learn from this, as Gary North explains, genocide still happens. It doesn't happen when the targets have guns. Now, this is a subject that we jumped into. We actually started this a few weeks ago with Neil, and let me just point out that Australia has almost 900,000 licensed gun owners, while Switzerland has a trained militia of some 140,000. These are normal citizens who work but are trained to fight. With a trained soldier armed with a submachine gun in many thousands of Swiss homes, Swiss crime rates are amongst Europe's lowest. Even with a border shared with Germany and in 2 world wars, no one chose to invade Switzerland. So what does this show us? Widespread private firearm ownership doesn't equate to more criminal activity. It does mean that in a crisis, people can protect themselves and come to the aid of others.
Yeah, absolutely. And another recent example is Mexico. The average Mexican citizen cannot easily legally own a firearm, and yet the amount of gun crime in Mexico is horrendous because the gangs have taken over and the average citizen can't defend themselves. This is really interesting, Andrew. I could talk to you about this all day, not just the guns, but tax and government. It's such a healthy conversation, and it's something we all need to think about, pray about as Christians, as you said, and really take action on, and I think get more vigilant and more proactive here in Australia. But Andrew McColl, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. Andrew is from Family Voice Australia. If you want to get in touch with Andrew, search them up on familyvoice.com.au. There's many great blogs and articles on there. They're doing a great job. And Andrew McColl, as always, such a pleasure to have you on 2020 Today.
Thank you, Andrew. Nice talking to you again.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.